Before Bitcoin, the internet had a problem it never truly solved: trust. By the early 2000s, we could send emails across continents in seconds, stream music instantly, and buy products from strangers we would never meet. Information moved freely, but value did not. Every attempt at digital money ran into the same wall. If something exists purely as data, what stops it from being copied? If anyone can duplicate a file, how can that file represent money? The solution, for decades, was always the same: introduce a trusted third party. Banks, payment processors, clearinghouses, and settlement layers became the guardians of digital value. They kept ledgers, verified balances, reversed mistakes, and ultimately decided what was valid and what was not. Digital money worked, but only because someone stood in the middle, watching everything. That worked until trust itself became the weakest link. The financial crisis of 2008 didn't just collapse banks, it collapsed confidence. People began to question whether institutions designed to manage risk actually understood it, or whether they were simply papering over problems until they exploded. In that environment, the idea of money that required trust in human judgment began to look fragile. This was the backdrop against which Bitcoin appeared. Not as a startup, not as a product, but as a proposal. A white paper that asked a radical question: what if we could replace trust with verification? What if the system didn't rely on institutions behaving well, but on mathematics behaving predictably? To do that, Bitcoin needed something stronger than reputation or regulation. It needed rules that could not be bent, exceptions that could not be granted, and history that could not be quietly rewritten. And this is where cryptography enters the story, not as decoration, but as foundation. At the heart of cryptography lies a simple but powerful idea: one-way functions, calculations that are easy to perform, but practically impossible to reverse. You can mix paint easily, but separating the colors afterward is nearly impossible. You can crack an egg, but you can't uncrack it. Bitcoin needed a digital equivalent of that irreversibility. This is where hash functions come in. A cryptographic hash function takes any input, text, numbers, files, entire databases, and transforms it into a fixed-length output. No matter how large or small the input is, the result always looks the same size. But the magic isn't the compression, it's the unpredictability. Change a single character in the input, and the output becomes completely different. Not slightly different, totally unrecognizable. There is no visible relationship between the input and the output, and no shortcut to guessing what the output will be without actually running the computation. For Bitcoin, this wasn't a technical curiosity. It was a necessity. If Bitcoin was going to exist without a central authority, it needed a way to anchor truth. A way to say, this happened, in this order, and cannot be changed without enormous effort. Hash functions made that possible. But not just any hash function would do. By the time Bitcoin was designed, many hash algorithms already existed. Some were fast, some were compact, some were already showing cracks. Satoshi Nakamoto had to choose something that balanced security, simplicity, and longevity. Something conservative, not experimental. Something trusted enough to withstand scrutiny, but boring enough not to surprise anyone. That choice was SHA-256. SHA-256 wasn't cutting edge when Bitcoin launched. It wasn't new. It wasn't exotic. It was part of a family of algorithms designed by the US National Security Agency and standardized years earlier. It had been studied, attacked, tested, and deployed across the world in countless systems. And that was precisely the point. Bitcoin didn't need novelty. It needed reliability. It needed an algorithm whose behavior was well understood, whose weaknesses were known, or at least loudly searched for, and whose mathematical properties were solid enough to serve as bedrock. SHA-256 offered something crucial: determinism without predictability. The same input will always produce the same output. Every computer, anywhere in the world, will agree on the result. But knowing the output tells you nothing useful about the input. There is no reverse path, no undo button, no hidden shortcut. This meant Bitcoin could create a shared reality. Every transaction could be hashed. Every block could include the hash of the previous one. And suddenly history became a chain, not metaphorically, but mathematically. To change one part of the past, you would have to change everything that came after it. And to do that, you would need to outcompute the entire network. This is the key shift Bitcoin introduced. Trust was no longer social. It was computational. You didn't have to trust miners. You didn't have to trust developers. You didn't even have to trust Satoshi. You could verify everything yourself using the same hash function, running the same calculations, and arriving at the same conclusions. SHA-256 became the silent referee of this system. It didn't judge intentions. It didn't care who you were. It simply enforced rules, relentlessly and impartially. In a world where institutions could fail, narratives could be rewritten, and promises could be broken, Bitcoin chose a different foundation, one built not on authority, but on math. And SHA-256 was the language that math spoke. The deeper question, then, is not just why Bitcoin uses SHA-256. It's why Bitcoin needed something like SHA-256 at all, and why, without it, the idea of trustless digital money would collapse under its own contradictions. That question takes us deeper into the nature of SHA-256 itself, and why its properties align so perfectly with what Bitcoin is trying to achieve. To understand why Bitcoin uses SHA-56, we have to strip away the mystique and look at what SHA-256 actually does. Not in code, but in concept. Imagine a machine that accepts anything you feed it. A sentence, a book, a photograph, a transaction, or an entire block of data. No matter what goes in, what comes out is always the same size, a 256-bit string. It looks random, it feels meaningless, and yet it is absolutely precise. This output is called a hash, and in Bitcoin, hashes are everywhere. The defining trait of SHA-256 is not secrecy, but structure. It does not encrypt data. It doesn't hide information so it can be revealed later. Instead, it compresses reality into a fingerprint, one that cannot be faked, duplicated, or reversed. The first critical property is that SHA-256 is one way. Given an input, computing the hash is easy. Given the hash, reconstructing the original input is effectively impossible, not difficult, not slow, impossible in any practical sense. There is no formula to reverse it. The only method is brute force, guessing inputs endlessly and hoping one produces the same output. This one-way nature is the cornerstone of Bitcoin's immutability. When a transaction is hashed, it becomes locked in a mathematical vault. The network does not need to remember the transaction itself to verify integrity. It only needs the hash. If the data changes, even slightly, the hash no longer matches. The system doesn't debate, it doesn't interpret, it rejects. But one-wayness alone is not enough. A weak hash function could still be manipulated if two different inputs produce the same output. This is known as a collision. If collisions were easy to find, Bitcoin would fall apart. Someone could alter transaction data while preserving the same hash, quietly rewriting history. SHA-256 resists this by design. The space of possible outputs is astronomically large. With 256 bits, there are more possible hashes than atoms in the observable universe. The probability of finding two different inputs that produce the same hash is so small that, for all practical purposes, it does not exist. Not today, not in decades, possibly not ever. This is what gives Bitcoin its confidence. Not legal confidence, statistical confidence. The kind that emerges when numbers become too large for intuition to grasp. Another subtle but vital property of SHA-256 is sensitivity. Change a single bit in the input, and the output changes completely. This is sometimes called the avalanche effect. In Bitcoin, this ensures that there is no gradual drift, no almost the same history. Blocks are either valid or they are not. This sensitivity transforms the blockchain into a structure of absolute precision. Each block contains the hash of the previous block. That hash is a summary of everything that came before it. Transactions, timestamps, metadata, compressed into a single 256-bit value. Alter one transaction from 10 years ago and every block after it becomes invalid. This is not enforced by law. It is enforced by math. SHA-256 makes the past brittle in exactly the right way. It can be built upon, but not edited. Like wet concrete that hardens into stone, the blockchain accepts new layers but refuses modification beneath them. This leads to a profound shift in how truth is established. In traditional systems, truth is stored in databases controlled by institutions. Errors can be corrected, records can be amended. Sometimes that flexibility is necessary, sometimes it is abused. Either way, truth remains negotiable. Bitcoin removes negotiation from the equation. Truth becomes the output of a calculation. If your node computes the same hash as everyone else, you are aligned with reality. If it doesn't, you are not. There is no appeal process, no override, no authority to persuade. This is what some call truth by computation. SHA-256 does not know what a transaction means. It does not know who sent what to whom. It does not understand money, identity, or intent. And that is precisely why it works. By being blind to context, it becomes immune to manipulation. Satoshi Nakamoto didn't choose SHA-256 because it was fast. In fact, it's deliberately not optimized for speed in ways that would weaken security. Nor was it chosen for elegance or novelty. It was chosen because it was predictable in the only way that mattered. It always followed the rules. Every node in the Bitcoin network runs SHA-256 independently. There is no central machine performing these hashes. No master copy of the ledger. Agreement emerges not from coordination, but from convergence. Everyone runs the same algorithm on the same data and reaches the same result. This is what allows Bitcoin to scale trust across strangers. You don't need to know who mined a block. You don't need to trust their motivations. You only need to verify that the hashes line up. If they do, the block is accepted. If they don't, it is ignored. SHA-256 becomes a kind of universal language, a way for machines operated by humans with conflicting incentives to agree on a shared history without ever speaking. And this is only half of its role. So far, SHA-256 has acted as a guardian of integrity, sealing the past and anchoring truth. But Bitcoin also uses SHA-256 to shape behavior in the present, to impose costs, to make dishonesty expensive, to understand that we have to look at mining, and the deliberate choice to tie SHA-256 to energy, time, and physical reality itself. Up to this point, SHA-256 has acted like a lock. It seals data, protects history, and ensures that once something is written into Bitcoin, it cannot be quietly changed. But Bitcoin does not live only in the past. It is a living system, constantly updating, constantly adding new blocks. And this raises a crucial question. Who gets to write the next page of history? If Bitcoin had simply allowed anyone to append blocks freely, the system would collapse into chaos. Conflicting versions of reality would appear instantly. Double spending would be trivial. There needed to be a mechanism to decide which version of the future was valid, without relying on identity, reputation, or permission. This is where SHA-256 stops being a passive guardian and becomes an active gatekeeper. Bitcoin uses SHA-256 as the core engine of proof of work, not as a symbolic ritual, but as a real, measurable cost imposed on participation. To add a block to the blockchain, miners must find a hash that meets a very specific condition. The output of SHA-256 must fall below a certain target. There is no trick to this, no shortcut, no clever math. The only way forward is brute force. Miners take the block data, add a small variable called a nonce, and hash the result. If the hash does not meet the target, they change the nonce and try again, and again, and again, billions or trillions of times. Each attempt is cheap, but finding a valid one is rare. This process turns SHA-56 into a digital lottery. Each hash attempt is a ticket. Most lose, a few win, and the probability of winning is directly tied to how much computational power you are willing to commit. This is not inefficiency by accident. It is inefficiency by design. Bitcoin intentionally makes block creation difficult while keeping block verification easy. Anyone can check a winning hash in a fraction of a second. But producing that hash requires real-world resources: electricity, hardware, time, and capital. This asymmetry is one of Bitcoin's most elegant features. It means that honesty is cheap to verify, but expensive to fake. If someone wants to rewrite history, they must redo the proof of work not just for one block, but for every block that comes after it. And they must do so faster than the rest of the network combined. SHA-256 makes this cost concrete. Energy is not a metaphor in Bitcoin. It is the wall. The system ties digital truth to physical reality by forcing participants to burn something valuable in the real world in order to influence the ledger. You cannot argue with a hash. You cannot bribe it. You cannot negotiate with electricity. This is why Bitcoin's energy usage, so often criticized, is actually central to its security model. The energy is not wasted. It is transformed into resistance against manipulation. And SHA-256 is the function that performs that transformation. Its design makes it ideal for this role. SHA-256 is computationally simple, but resistant to optimization beyond raw hardware improvements. There is no algorithmic shortcut that suddenly makes hashing trivial. The fastest way to compute SHA-256 is to compute SHA-256 over and over again. This predictability is crucial. It ensures that competition among miners is fair in a very specific sense. Everyone is playing the same game. The rules do not change depending on who you are. Over time, this led to the development of specialized hardware known as ASICs. These machines do one thing exceptionally well: compute SHA-256 hashes. They are not general-purpose computers. They cannot be repurposed easily. Their value is almost entirely tied to the Bitcoin network. This had an unintended but powerful effect. By making mining hardware highly specialized, Bitcoin raised the cost of attack even further. An attacker cannot simply rent generic computing power and rewrite history. They must acquire or control vast amounts of purpose-built equipment, along with the energy infrastructure to run it. SHA-256 became not just a cryptographic function, but an economic moat. If you invest heavily in mining hardware, your incentives align with the health of the network. Attacking Bitcoin would devalue the very assets you depend on. Proof of work, powered by SHA-256, doesn't assume miners are good actors. It makes bad behavior irrational. This is a subtle but critical point. Bitcoin does not rely on trust in human virtue. It relies on incentives shaped by math and physics. SHA-256 is the bridge that connects digital actions to physical consequences. The longer the chain grows, the heavier it becomes. Each new block adds more accumulated work, more energy embedded in history. To challenge that history, an attacker would have to outspend the collective effort of millions of machines across the globe. This is why Bitcoin's past becomes more secure with time, not because people believe in it more, but because it becomes more expensive to undo. SHA-256 enables this time-based security. Each block is a layer of hardened computation, each hash a scar left by energy consumption. The blockchain becomes a monument built not of stone, but of work. And yet, despite all this, a question lingers. What if SHA-256 becomes obsolete? What if a better algorithm exists? What if technology changes in ways Satoshi could not foresee? To answer that, we have to step back and ask not how SHA-56 works, but what it represents, and why Bitcoin's choice may be more timeless than it appears. At first glance, SHA-256 can feel like an arbitrary detail, just one algorithm among many. Replace it with something newer, faster, more modern, and Bitcoin would still work, at least in theory. But this way of thinking misses something essential about Bitcoin's design philosophy. Bitcoin was never built to be cutting edge. It was built to endure. Satoshi Nakamoto made a radical proposal, but wrapped it in conservative engineering. Instead of inventing new cryptography, Bitcoin assembled well-known components in a way no one had tried before. SHA-256 was not chosen because it was exciting. It was chosen because it was boring, predictable, and already battle-tested. That conservatism matters. In cryptography, novelty is a liability. New algorithms often look strong until they are attacked in unexpected ways. Weaknesses surface slowly, sometimes years after deployment. SHA-256, by contrast, had already survived extensive analysis by academics, governments, and industry. If there were catastrophic flaws, they likely would have been found. Bitcoin needed that kind of confidence. When you are designing money, there is no safe upgrade path. You cannot pause the system, rewrite history, or quietly swap out the foundation without consequences. The cryptographic choices you make on day one echo for decades. This is why Bitcoin has remained on SHA-256 even as newer hash functions have appeared. The question is not whether a different algorithm might be marginally better today. The question is whether changing it would be worth the risk. And in Bitcoin's case, the answer has consistently been no. SHA-256 has another advantage that often goes unnoticed: simplicity. Its design is straightforward, with no hidden complexity that could lead to subtle vulnerabilities. This makes it easier to implement correctly, easier to audit, and easier for independent developers to verify. Complexity is the enemy of decentralization. If only experts can understand or implement the core cryptography, power concentrates. SHA-256 lowers the barrier. It allows many independent implementations to exist, reducing the risk of a single point of failure. Then there is the question of the future, especially quantum computing. It is often said that quantum computers will break Bitcoin. This is an oversimplification. While quantum advances may eventually threaten certain cryptographic assumptions, SHA-256 is not easily undone by known quantum algorithms. Grover's algorithm, often cited in this context, would only provide a quadratic speedup, not a complete collapse. The solution is straightforward. Increase difficulty, not abandon the function. More importantly, Bitcoin is not frozen in time. If a truly existential threat emerged, the network could adapt through consensus. But the threshold for change is intentionally high. Bitcoin does not optimize for rapid evolution. It optimizes for resistance to unnecessary change. This is another reason SHA-256 fits so well. It embodies the same philosophy as Bitcoin itself: slow, deliberate, and hard to move. Bitcoin does not chase efficiency at the cost of security. It does not adopt trends for their own sake. It waits, it observes, it survives. There is also a deeper symbolic layer to this choice. SHA-256 represents the idea that rules should be stronger than rulers. Once deployed, the algorithm does not care who uses it. Governments use SHA-256, corporations use it, individuals use it, and Bitcoin uses it in a way that no single group controls. This neutrality is crucial. Bitcoin's security does not depend on secrecy. The algorithm is public. The code is open. The rules are visible to everyone. This transparency is not a weakness. It is the source of trust. You do not trust Bitcoin because you don't know how it works. You trust it because you do. If SHA-256 were replaced with a proprietary or obscure algorithm, Bitcoin would lose something fundamental. Its claim to being trustless would be weakened. Trust would shift from math to expertise, from verification to authority. By sticking with SHA-256, Bitcoin anchors itself to something external and objective, a function that exists independently of Bitcoin, studied by people who have no stake in its success. That separation is a form of protection. In the end, asking why Bitcoin uses SHA-256 is really asking why Bitcoin looks the way it does. Bitcoin is slow because speed invites shortcuts. It is energy intensive because cost deters abuse. It is conservative because stability beats elegance when the stakes are high. SHA-256 is not perfect. No algorithm is. But perfection was never the goal. Reliability was. Predictability was. And above all, the ability to create a system where trust emerges not from belief, but from verification. Bitcoin does not ask you to trust SHA-256 blindly. It invites you to test it, run it, challenge it, and rely on it only insofar as it continues to behave exactly as expected. That is why Bitcoin uses SHA-256. Not because it is fashionable, not because it is mysterious, but because, in a world full of promises, Bitcoin chose math, and chose one of the most unassuming, resilient pieces of math available to stand in place of trust.